Hey guys, welcome back in. This is Unit 3. By this point, you've actually processed through kind of the foundations and whatnot, and you looked at the legislative branch, the lawmaking process. And so now we're going to shift our attention to look at once those laws are made, what is the responsibility on carrying out those laws and who is given that responsibility? This is typically referred to as the executive responsibility or the executive branch of government. The executive branch of government in the United States is headed by the President of the United States, and it's given more of a what we call a top-down bureaucratic kind of organizational pattern where the president ultimately sits at the top of the entire bureaucracy. And so everything within the executive bureaucracy from a federal point of view is all really under the purview of the president of the United States. And so it is often confused that the governor of Texas is like the president of the United States, just at a state level. That is not accurate, and that could not be more inaccurate. We hesitated with the construction of a strong executive. If you recall from Unit 1, the 1874 election pitted a relatively strong governor in E.J. Davis that was operating under the radical Reconstruction Constitution of 1869 with a more outspoken, more conservative, more traditional Texas and Richard Koch. And what we saw here is we saw an election that led to the drafting of a new constitution ultimately adopted in 1876. Well, when we met for that 1876 adoption, it was very, very clear we wanted to prevent anything like E.J. Davis's governorship from ever being possible in Texas again. And so that's exactly what we did. We broke the executive up in small, fragmented pieces that has become known as the plural executive. The governor is just one part of that plural executive. In fact, he's not sitting over the other executive officers. The lieutenant governor is a separate office completely and given charge over things truly autonomous from what the governor is allowed to touch. The Secretary of State is another executive officer appointed by the governor, but still very autonomous in the actions that he has to carry out. The Comptroller of Public Accounts is another one that we're going to look at. All of these individuals sit atop of this fragmented plural executive that really leads one to wonder who's actually in charge of Texas. This has led scholars to a lot of question marks on how we go forward and what we do when we kind of decide who's most powerful and who's really calling the shots. In Texas, quite often, Abbott takes a lot of heat for things that he doesn't really have the power to do. This is a constant refrain, and it's an easy target. It makes Abbott rather an easy target for some criticism, as people can throw criticism at Abbott for saying, well, Abbott didn't do this or this or this, and Abbott based it back and say, well, I couldn't. I don't have the power to do what you're asking me to do. And so as we look at the governorship, it's important to understand that plural nature of the executive, which is designed to limit the executive, to limit the state oversight of law, and really keep the state government small. So it forces us to ask ourselves, okay, then who's running local affairs and whatnot? This is going to empower our localities, our cities, our states, and what's known as special purpose districts, like primarily schools, your independent districts and schools. Here in Killeen, we have the city of Killeen, and then we have Killeen Independent School District. And a lot of people think they're one and the same, that the city of Killeen runs the Killeen Independent School District. That is not the case. The city of Killeen is a municipality, and so it operates based on a contract, based on governance, based on an agreement that is there to govern those that live within the political boundaries of the city of Killeen. Killeen Independent School District is a completely different governing agency. Its borders are far greater than the city of Killeen. It's run by different rules, it's financed differently, and it has its own legislative branch, and it has its own executive officers. And so when we start looking at who's actually making these smaller level rules and carrying out things on a local level where it most often hits you or impacts you the greatest, that's really where we get into localities and special purpose districts. And the reason why this is important is, once again, a lot of people want to immediately go to the state. If we have a trouble or if we have a concern or something is not working well, we want to run to the state and say, why isn't the state doing this? Why isn't the federal government doing this? And many times the answer to that question is, Because we haven't allowed the federal government to do it, and we haven't allowed the state government to do it. And one could reasonably argue that it's good that they're not doing it. That in the absence of a great answer, a poor answer that's executive at a state level or executed at a federal level may actually cause a wealth of calamity throughout the entire United States or throughout the state. And so, in the absence of a great answer, we may want to keep it to localities and let local school districts kind of decide what's best. Let local firehouse and water municipality or water conservation districts figure out what is the need in their district and kind of meet the need where it is at that local level. And so localities are a critical component of this executive process and how we carry out the laws. And we see this, like I said, throughout the state of Texas. The last thing we're going to cover in this unit are interest groups. And those often get a bad reputation. And so a lot of people simply look at interest groups as they're inherently bad. They're inherently corrupt. All they do is bribe politicians and whatnot. That's not quite accurate. Yes, there are some overlapping tendencies which have been exploited, which have been called corrupt, which have been called a conflict of interest. But much of what special interest groups do is they inform the government, they inform governing officials, and they're very good at it. And so when we start looking at the legislative process and the executive process is going to have to carry out laws, and there's a lot of ambiguity in the laws. The laws aren't written always as complete as we may want them to be. And so in that ambiguity, in the gray areas, right, there's going to be a process that has to be done on how do we actually carry out this law. If I have a law to build 500 miles of road in Texas, well, who actually plans it? Who actually implements it? What construction company carries that out? What's the best way to carry it out? An executive member, an executive agency may call in companies, corporations, and even special interest groups to inform, to guide, knowing that they are the experts in their field. Now, it's important that if we're going to accept them as experts in their field, and if we're going to expect these kind of these groups as forces of information, we have to keep in the back of our minds that they still work for a corporation. They still work for a company. And so we can't make them all bad, but it doesn't mean that what they're telling us is all wrong either. And so we need a more complex understanding of interest groups and what they do and how they involve themselves in the different functions of government, right? And so as you walk through this unit, we're going to paint this picture of how those three kind of play in together, hopefully to give you a better understanding of how the laws actually come into manifestation in Texas and who's really involved in that process.